Chinese markets finally coming back after a 9-day Lunar New Year break, and we might see a little bit more of a supportive backdrop. MSCI China, for example, gaining more than 1% since the mainland Chinese markets were away on holidays. Sentiment has improved. China could be facing lower levies after the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to strike down Trump's reciprocal tariffs. But let's discuss what all of this means with Hao Hong, managing partner and CIO at Lotus Asset Management. Hao, always good to have you with us. Of course, I mentioned the positive aspect of the tariffs, but also we could see more new national security tariffs, 15% tariffs on top of that. Not to mention geopolitical tensions around Iran. What else? AI disruption fears. So what will be important for Chinese investors as we see them reopen?
Yeah, well, I think even though Trump quickly slapped on a new form of tax, I think for the Chinese exports, the overall average tariff is still down, and especially, the tariff based on fentanyl and all that, those tariffs is going away for the time being. So I think, during the holiday, because today is the first day of trading, but during the holiday, we're seeing, the A50 futures and also the Chinese yuan reacting positively to the news. And also yesterday, Hong Kong had a really big day as well, big day surge as well. So one, shouldn't be surprised to see, the positive sentiment pass on to the Asia today.
How important is the AI theme in the Chinese markets, especially with the likes of Jipu, Minimax as well, that are really exposed to that LLM market?
Yeah, I think, last year this time, we saw the DeepSeek moment for the Chinese market, right? So, there was a huge rally, especially in the mainland Chinese market. The new tech board actually has been one of the best performing index last year and continue to do so year today. I think, for Chinese LLM AI companies, they are trying very hard to catching up. I think the perceived gap between U.S. and China is quickly narrowing. And also China, after the achievement in software, I think, China is ramping up on hardware as well, so one shouldn't be surprised to see, big positive news coming up from the Chinese chip sector this year.
We've seen pretty strong numbers out of Chinese New Year. We've seen this kind of continuation of a temporary truce between the US and China. Do you think that feeds into what you said is the start of a virtuous cycle, including the repatriation of funds back into domestic investment?
Yeah, I think it's happening. Ever since last year, and if you look at the US dollar deposit in Hong Kong banking system, for example, surged a couple of $100 billion US dollars last year. And I think mainland Chinese money and mainland Chinese rich people continue to flow into the Hong Kong market. And also overseas, as you can see, last year the US dollar suffered a rather significant depreciation. I think it's actually one of the worst performing year in decades. I think the trend is continuing, and people smell the opportunity here in Asia, in particular in China. So, money are actually coming back. So then, as you can see, last year the U.S. dollar's significant depreciation is a sign suggesting that, the money is being rotated out of the U.S. market and going into Asia, in particular China. So this year, one of the major themes should be, the continuing appreciation of the Chinese yuan. It's already well past 7, and with the economic cycle continuing, and also China making progress in industrials and software sectors, I think the yuan appreciation story should continue on this year.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad-based bull case, right? The old sectors, industrial, commodities, energy, but also high tech. And I do wonder, does that include sort of specific robotics names, particularly after that very impressive viral performance in the Spring Gala?
Yeah, I think everybody watched the Spring Gala during Chinese New Year. It's one of the most watched show on earth. So I think during the show, many of the robot companies actually featured their robots on the show, dancing and doing martial arts and all that. It was very eye-catching, and soon after that, when the Hong Kong market reopened, we saw a huge surge on many of the robotic names as well. So I think China is making very good progress in robots, and also the manufacturing cost is coming down very, very fast as well. And some of the robots, simple robots, is actually available for commercial use, for family use now. So I think, the progress will accelerate from here. And I think, this is one of the sectors that we should be watching for in the Chinese market.
I mean, other than the exuberance around artificial intelligence, robotics, what about can that sector support the broader fundamental part of the economy? Say, if, as you said, manufacturing costs are coming down, could this help with factory numbers as well? And what have you seen, or what sense are you getting from the holiday spending that could give us some indication whether consumers are starting to spend again?
Yeah, I think that is probably, one of the sectors that is still lagging, in terms of economic performance. I think retail sales in the second half of last year actually decelerated, after the national consumption stimulus finished. So I think, people are looking for, new forms of consumption handouts, consumption coupons maybe this year after the twin sessions. I think this year, the Chinese consumer names would have like some tailwinds behind it. For example, just now we discussed the appreciation of Chinese yuan, right? So it actually increased the buying power of Chinese consumers and make imports from foreign countries cheaper. Already, this Lunar New Year, we're seeing something that hasn't happened for a long time, which is that, many of our friends and relatives is actually spending the New Year holiday overseas. All right, so, probably because of the Chinese yuan and also probably because of a rather buoyant Chinese market, and people actually make money last year, and it hasn't happened for a long time. So I think, this year the positive trends would continue. I think, we're likely to see more consumption-focused stimulus after the twin session. Consumption is, one of the key policy focus for the next 5 years, for the new 5-year plan. So I think besides consumption stimulus, new forms of tax reduction and also family help assistance, retirement assistance, etc., we should be seeing more details after the twin sessions.
Hao Hong, always great to have you with us, Managing Partner and CIO at Lotus Asset Management.